Welcome, everyone. We are so glad you're here today. I'm Kathy Dwyer, the senior pastor here at Rock Spring, and if you were with us this morning, you know you're in for a treat this afternoon. I want to give you a little, you might wonder, well, why are we doing this? A small group in our congregation had an alumni from Lancaster Seminary who said, gosh, I have this great professor who could speak with us. And I think Dr. Carey first came to talk about the Paul's epistle, and then later came back and spoke with this small group via Zoom on Christian nationalism. I was a part of that small group, as were several others, all of whom said, this is so important. We need to share this more broadly. So whether you are tuning in online or you are here in our sanctuary, we are so glad that you are here for this important conversation, Christian nationalism, what it is, and why it is a danger for our democracy and our gospel. Dr. Carey is warm, engaging, provocative, a true academic. He has authored or co-authored 10 volumes. And he will say that his vocation is animated by his engagement with students who are interested in ministry and proclaiming the gospel, and that is clear that he has that relational component to his soul, and we have been blessed by that today. Join me in welcoming Dr. Carey.
Thank you, Kathy. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad you're here, and I'm certainly glad to be here. I've had a pretty great visit and received wonderful hospitality. I'll share a little bit about what to expect. The first thing is I ask, and you knew it from the advertising, I always ask for 90 minutes. And I haven't had anyone complain about the 90-minute ask, but that's a long time. And I talk at you for the first 60. So watch out for that. There are slides involved, and if we could start the slideshow too, and maybe even just go to the second slide. There are slides involved. Though I'm not a slide reader, I use them for points of reference for everyone. I don't know about you, but if somebody's talking to me for 60 minutes, I'm zoning out. So that helps with that. On the second slide, please, Jared. There we go. And you could show that whole slide if you want, because that's a QR code, and it links to a bibliography I use or have built up over the past few years, if you're interested in it. And if you don't want to do the QR code thing and you want to ask one of the pastors, I'll email the link, and that's just fine. So the next thing I'd like to say, there are three opening things I want to say. The second thing I want to say is, I'm not an expert on Christian nationalism. There are people who research it as sociologists, church historians, political scientists, you name it. I'm a biblical scholar. I have tracked conservative American Christianity for a long time, but became more intensely interested in this area, gosh, what do you know, 7 or 8 years ago, and began offering these kinds of talks about 2.5 years ago. The last thing is, we're in a church, and I am not here to do a partisan presentation. The simple fact is, you can't talk about Christian nationalism in the United States without brushing on political figures, and while I won't name political parties, it also won't be ambiguous. And so I'm just naming that. I'm not here to promote a political agenda other than democracy. And one of the things that I've learned over the time of doing this is, to me, some of those valuable people I care about in our society right now are people I disagree with politically who are conservative, who love democracy. And they are critical right now. So that. We'll be talking about what Christian nationalism is, Very briefly, a little historical background about where it comes from, and then we'll spend more time on how it works, how it shapes social attitudes, what political agenda accompanies it, and finally, how Christians might respond to it as a movement. So, Jared, next slide. A lot of people had not heard the term Christian nationalism until fairly recently, a few years ago. Many people who are Christian nationalists will tell you, oh, they just made up that term to attack Christians who love their country. That's not the case. Scholars have been researching Christian nationalism intensely for 20 years. You can do a scholar search on Christian nationalism and find this scholarship has been going on for more like 70 or 80 years. And it's fairly simple to define. First, Christian nationalists believe the United States has a special relationship with God. God founded this place to be a Christian nation. The founders were Christian. They meant to found a Christian nation. And so the expectation from God is that we live out that Christian identity as they understand it. And God blesses the United States and has blessed the United States in special ways. They therefore want the United States to declare that we're a Christian nation in official ways and in symbolic ways and in our national practices and rituals. And then finally, they'll say things like, we should govern this country according to a Christian worldview or according to biblical values. And that's where it gets sticky. Well, it's sticky already. It's sticky as soon as any religious group wants authority over the rest of society. It's even more sticky when one Christian group claims that their values speak for all Christians. Because, as you probably know, many denominations and churches have social values statements. They don't align with each other. There's no single way of being Christian and looking at society, no more than there are one kind of Christian theology. And so, next slide, Jared, thank you. I would offer that was a standard academic definition. This is a more functional one. And I'm going to add the word white to it. White Christian nationalism really organizes around a very narrow set of political goals, and it uses the language of Christianity and the symbols of Christianity to enhance the authority of that kind of politics. And so I like to say that Christian nationalism baptizes its politics with the gospel. Before we go to the next slide, I'm warning you about it. It's controversial. It's the only slide in this presentation, other than the first one, that has never changed. Let's go, Jared. What does white Christian nationalism look like? And why am I saying it? Why am I saying it? So you might remember this moment. It was summer of 2020, election season. Also, Black Lives Matter protests after the police murder of George Floyd. Here is then President Donald Trump in front of St. John's Episcopal Parish in the district. You see that it's boarded up. There has been some violence and property damage in some of the protests. Donald Trump wanted to suppress the protests. We now know he asked the chair of the Joint Chiefs, can't we just shoot them in the legs or something? That is, use the military against American citizens. He went outside to the Rose Garden and made a speech calling for the end of the protests, but then he had force clear the path of protesters so he could go to this church and stand where he did not make a speech. He stood for photographs. And this is sort of the lasting image. Why am I using it? Because it's a clear instance of using symbols of Christianity as props for political authority. So when I say props, that sounds cynical, so I feel I need to justify that. The church is a prop in the sense that no one from the White House asked, can we use your church for this photo opportunity? The Bishop of Washington the next day asked, said, no, nobody asked, and we wouldn't have wanted him there. We wouldn't have wanted him to use our church that way. So it's a prop. The Bible is a prop in this way. I mean, the White House is one of Donald Trump's primary residences while he's president, and he did not have a Bible in the White House. So they collected Bibles, right? And he went through them on a table and identified the Bible that was most photocopy. I think, didn't he do well? And so the Bible here is a prop too. And then there's one thing I haven't said that I am waiting on somebody to think. Oh. Yeah, no. And that is this moment of Christian nationalist political expression, right? The use of Christian symbols to buttress political authority is also about white political authority. If we forget that we're talking about the Black Lives Matter protest and the politics of race, then we're really not being serious about what's at stake in that moment. So not all Christian nationalists are white, but as I will show in some of the data associated with it, it tracks with race in profound ways. And so many interpreters refer to it as white Christian nationalism. So what about the history? Next slide, please, Jared. What about the history behind it? We'll often hear Christian nationalists say, the founders were Christians and they intended to found a Christian nation. And then you'll often hear other people say, no, America was founded as a secular, inclusive society. It wasn't founded as a Christian nation. And the truth is, it's really complicated. It's really complicated. John Fea, who is a conservative evangelical historian, quite prominent, who teaches up the road from us in Lancaster at Messiah University now, wrote a book about 12 years ago, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? And he says, well, when are we talking about? And who are we talking about? Are we talking 1620 in Massachusetts Bay? They meant to found a Christian nation. Are we talking about Rhode Island? Well, those were Christians too. They were fleeing from the Christians in Massachusetts Bay, right? Well, what about Virginia? Well, Anglicans, but did the people who settled Virginia care much about being Anglicans? Not a whole lot. Now, Virginians did come to care and had an established church, and Baptists in Virginia pressed for a religious freedom clause, right? And leaned on James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. You get the point I'm trying to... And in Pennsylvania, by the way, it was founded to be a pluralistic society. So lots of Christian mutts, Anabaptists, Amish, Church of the Brethren, Mennonites, Quakers, and so forth, settled there. The other part of the story I want to call attention to, though, is, Jared, we are a couple of slides ahead. We can stop right there and be fine. That mainline churches, like United Church of Christ, Presbyterian, Episcopal, have long used the argument that America was a Christian nation, with a major initiative going back to the fight against communism in the 1930s. And so it was mainline Christians who insisted on having "under God" added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954, and "In God We Trust" as the national motto in 1956. So we don't get to say, if we're mainline Christians, that, it's just those evangelical religious right types over there. We help build this ship. Fea calls attention to, however, the moment of working on the Constitution. And at that moment, the founders made the explicit choice to include clauses that made it possible to exercise religion freely, to prohibit the state, that is, the republic, establishing any one religion over others, right? And ruling out religious tests for office holders. The Constitution never mentions God, never mentions the Bible, never mentions Christianity. But attempts to create space for persons of all faiths or no faiths to be part of the society and its governance. It was James Madison who talked about, next slide, in terms of the separation of church and state. And he said it's to keep the kinds of religious wars that had killed tens of millions of people in Europe over the past couple of centuries and resulted in civil war in England just over a century before, including beheading a king, right? That the motive for founding this kind of society where there was room for everyone but no one gets to take charge meant you didn't have to fight over it. And that was one of the reasons. Today, when we imagine Christian nationalism, we might think of it primarily in one flavor. Next slide. Thank you, Jared. We might think of it in terms of like a Mike Pence figure. He is a figure of the traditional religious right, respectable, dark suit, white shirt, boring tie. That's the uniform. And, you think of a certain kinds of Christianity. You might go back to a Jerry Falwell. You might remember Ralph Reed and the Christian Coalition. You have that kind of sense of what's going on. But another stream of Christian nationalism that we're dealing with now is we would call Catholic integralism, which is an attempt to have the government serve the churches of the purposes of the church. And we've learned fairly recently that J.D. Vance is heavily influenced as someone in the Catholic integralism movement. If you were part of the making fun of the childless cat ladies thing, or if you're a Swiftie, I found out I married a Swiftie about a year ago, then you're aware that he's very much about promoting large nuclear families. He has argued that citizens who don't have children should have their votes count once, but parents should be able to vote on behalf of their children whose votes would then count, and that would amplify their influence, since he argues parents have more at stake than people who don't have children. That point of view comes from his conversion to Roman Catholicism in a specific context, and he has written about it. But the third stream of Christian nationalism, the one most powerfully aligned with the kind of anti-democratic politics we've been experiencing over a lot longer time than I like to think about, is something called the New Apostolic Reformation. And I would invite you, how many of you are familiar just with the term? It's rare, if you looked around, it's rare that I speak to a group and more than 20% of people raise their hands. And yet, you really need to know. One way that I could explain it is, if you think about the pictures of Donald Trump when he was a candidate and president, being surrounded by preachers who have their hands on him, 90% of them are New Apostolic Reformation figures. And so the New Apostolic Reformation is a movement that's been going on for about 35 years. I encountered it first 12 years ago in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where I live. It's not denominational. It's on the edges of what we would call the Pentecostal charismatic Christianity, which is interested in spiritual gifts and mystical experiences, things like faith healing, speaking in tongues, being able to prophesy. And that stream of Christianity is much bigger than the New Apostolic Reformation. Sometimes it has denominations, but the New Apostolic Reformation is entirely non-denominational. Its organization revolves around individuals who are, in the movement, prophets and apostles. This is extremely important. It means they speak directly for God. Because God gives them, and they routinely talk about the dreams and visions they had the night before and align around it. They also teach, all three flavors of Christian nationalism teach something we could call dominionism. And dominionism is the idea that Christians should exercise dominion over the rest of society. In New Apostolic Reformation, the distinctive teaching is what they call seven mountains, or 7M, the letter M for mountain. Seven mountains dominionism, in which they understand society to be made of seven spheres of influence, or cultural mountains. So religion would be one, government would be one, family, business, media, entertainment. I always forget. Education. First time I've gotten all seven. I first heard that in Lancaster in 2012 when a friend from my hometown in Alabama invited me to a convention, and a mile from my campus, I had no idea, 5,000 Christians were coming to Lancaster. We had lunch. The waitress said, "Boy, the Christians are horrible tippers." And I only stayed inside for about 30 minutes, but there was a preacher from Pasadena, you'll hear about later, named Cheon, and I'd never heard a preacher talk like him. It was sort of like watching the opening monologue for a talk show, except it was long, and he was talking about taking dominion, and I was chilled. That was the first time I just started reading what journalism there was at that point about the movement. Now there's quite a bit of scholarship. Third thing, they practice something they call strategic spiritual warfare. Many Christians are familiar with the language of spiritual warfare, the idea that Satan's always trying to trip you up and get you to fall into sin or be confused. Strategic political warfare is political and institutional. It's the belief that actual demons inhabit government institutions or places, and through a series of spiritual practices, you try to wage spiritual warfare to cast these demons out. You may remember the political advisor Roger Stone, who is on tape talking about having seen a demonic portal circling over the White House and claiming you can see it in photographs. And in Lancaster, we had a drag queen story hour that was scheduled for the public library. Christian Dominionists did a Jericho march. They circled it 7 times and then blew ram's horns, shofars, appropriated from Judaism, right, in an attempt to drive the spirits out that were plaguing Lancaster County. Finally, I'm not going to go into a lot of theological detail. They're postmillennialists. And what that means is they believe that through their efforts, God is going to bring God's reign to earth, and then Jesus can return. So they're highly activated. Their agenda is distinctly political and dominionist, and their influence, new research is showing, is spreading well beyond the boundaries of that movement, so that most people who identify as evangelical now affirm Seven Mountains Dominionism, if they're asked in a survey. I don't know what that means. Next slide. This is Lance Wallnow, who's a Pennsylvanian, talking about how we talk about dominion when we're talking to each other, but don't talk about dominion like if outsiders are there, because guess what? People don't want us dominating them. I mean, just being very frank about the strategy. Lance Wallnow is the prophet who said that Donald Trump was God's chosen candidate and compared him to the Persian emperor Cyrus, who is called God's anointed in the book of Isaiah. Anointed is the same word for Messiah. And the point is that Cyrus is not an Israelite or a Jew. He's a pagan, but he's saving the Judeans from exile. And that's a belief that has become widespread among right-wing Christians. A researcher named Matt Taylor out of Baltimore has argued, and he was on NPR Weekend earlier, Matthew Taylor, has argued that 10 or 15 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, religious right people would have laughed at the New Apostolic Reformation people. They're wild. Their worship services are wild. Faith healings and yelling and prophecies and all that. And now they are the driving force of religious Christian nationalism in the United States. Next slide. Recently, a viral video went out with a woman named Rihanna Teixeira, who I think she says she's 38 and has left the movement. And she says, there's a world created in that system where you don't question the prophets. You don't go against what the prophets are saying because they're the literal voice of God coming to us. So the movement is top-down, authoritarian, right? How do you speak against somebody who tells you what God told them last night? Well, now, recently, when you've got someone operating in manipulation, intimidation, and domination, especially when it's in a female role, guess who he was talking about? She's running for president. She's a black woman, multiracial, but she's black. This is relevant. Trying to emasculate a man who's standing for the truth. You're dealing with a, quote, Jezebel spirit. He's saying she's inhabited by a demon. I shared this recently in a multiracial, multi-faith context, and a black woman said, you need to understand how much that language hurts a black woman, how long the language of Jezebel has been used to hypersexualize, sort of a form of slut-shaming aimed at black women who might be strong. And I said, I knew that, but I wasn't sensitive to it, and so now I want to name that this is what's going on. He's using not just the language of spiritual warfare, but racist, misogynistic language when he's doing this. Look up Lance Wall now. Look up his followers on YouTube and Facebook. We're talking millions. That spirit, that occult spirit, is operating on her and through her. So we have learned, the next slide please, Sharon. We've learned that the January 6th committee from the House of Representatives discovered that in the run-up to the January 6th assault on the Capitol, the founder of the Oath Keepers, Stuart Rhodes, was coordinating with two New Apostolic Reformation figures in the planning of what happened on January 5th and 6th. And it just so happened that those two operatives were Trump administration officials. We've also learned, next slide please, that 8 days before the Capitol riot or insurrection or assault, a dozen to 15 prophets and apostles were in the White House for 2 hours. And when they left, they said, we were there, we had a wonderful time, we were praying and strategizing, and great things are going to happen. 8 days before the January 6th. So you have a rally of New Apostolic Reformation figures, Proud Boys and Oath Keepers in December, I think the 12th. You have another rally of, they claim, hundreds of thousands around the Capitol on January the 5th. And then you have on January 6th, next slide, 4 of the 6 protest permits that were issued went to New Apostolic Reformation figures. I mentioned Cheon. Next slide. This is what he said on January 5th. I believe that this week we're going to throw Jezebel out, and Jehu, who is the Israelite king who slaughtered Jezebel or had her killed, Jehu's going to rise up, and we're going to rule and reign through President Trump and under the lordship of Jesus Christ, which does not sound like a democratic process, right? And it indicates that a total alignment, Jesus Christ, Donald Trump, we, in his politics. Next slide. In 2020 and 2021, you remember how much chaos happened after we voted. But that chaos was organized, but it was not well organized. This time, the election subversion is already organized. New Apostolic Reformation figures have been doing what they call courage tour events in swing states. In Eau Claire, Wisconsin, they held a rally that drew 2,500 people with 50,000 online watchers. And it started as sort of a spiritual rally, but then the call was, we want you to volunteer to be poll watchers or election workers. In Lancaster County, the pastor who organized the Jericho March around our library is a judge of elections. Imagine Wisconsin. Imagine that 50 people responded to that call. Imagine that on or after the election, 15 of those 50 say, I saw something wrong. Imagine that Wisconsin, as a result, can't certify its vote before the votes are supposed to go to Congress. This is the work that is already underway. It's why the Harris administration, as I understand it, has 10 times as many lawyers as, not administration, campaign, has 10 times as many lawyers as the Biden campaign had 4 years ago. And if you're following the news, you see other things going on along these lines. Just today I saw that the governor of Oklahoma just struck 1/5 of the state's voters off the rolls. And Oklahoma is not a contested state. I had to double check. I thought, this, you saw it on the internet. Is it real? There's reporting in Oklahoma. It's very real. How does Christian nationalism shape attitudes? How does it work? This is the research largely of political scientists and sociologists. And one whom I admire a lot is a guy named Robert P. Jones. He's the founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI. And in 2020, he wrote, this book is fabulous, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. Jones finds that when you measure people's attitudes on a host of social issues and then match that up to their religious identity, this is all survey data, right? What you find is, that he says is remarkable, is imagine two groups who believe almost entirely the same things theologically. So that would be black Protestants and white evangelicals. They believe about the same things theologically. They often live in close proximity to one another. Why would they be the two groups mapped to religion farthest apart on many social attitudes? What is it that separates white evangelicals from black Protestants if they live near each other and agree on their theologies? Well, he says the answer is whiteness, white supremacy. And if you're, a Church of Christ kind of person or other kind of mainline Christian, you might be thinking, yeah, those white evangelicals, those people. Unfortunately, all white Christians are way out on the end, just not as far as the evangelicals on these questions. The identified by religion closest group to black Protestants is now the largest religious group in the United States, no religious affiliation. And Jones says, I'm going to put it my way, I'm nicer than he is. He's actually an incredibly nice person and nicer than I am. I'm going to say it nicer than he says it. Jones says, the more white people go to church, the more racist we become. Something about American white Christianity fosters and enables racism. I would say the more we go to church, the more alienated we become from our black and brown brothers and sisters. But what about these attitudes? This is where it gets fast, Jared. Other sociologists, Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead, have correlated opinions to a scale measuring how strongly people identify with Christian nationalist beliefs. Things like, would you like to see America declare itself a Christian nation? Those kinds of survey questions. And they picked 6 of those survey questions, and other social attitudes. What they found was people who have strong affinity with Christian nationalism are more likely than other Americans to, one, demand respect for national symbols and traditions, holidays, flag, national anthem, Pledge of Allegiance. Next slide. More likely than other Americans to be suspicious of racial and religious minorities, especially immigrants. Next slide. More likely than other Americans to regard inequality, racial inequalities, things like infant mortality, educational attainment, income, wealth, health care, average life expectancy. The kinds of differences we have in those outcomes that map onto race, they're more likely than other Americans to say that's the fault of the black and brown people, rather than that's the result of a history of racism or social structures that make things the way they are. They're more likely than other Americans not to believe that there's racial inequality in the criminal justice system, more likely than other Americans to condone violent police tactics. Next slide. They're more likely than other Americans to support restrictive voting measures, which we have seen just amplify since the Shelby decision in, I think, 2013. This next one might shock you. They're more likely than other Americans to believe that white people and Christians are the most persecuted groups in the United States. Most people who score high on Christian nationalism believe that Christians are persecuted in the United States, and they use that language all the time. Next one, last of these. They're more likely than other Americans to oppose science and science education. This probably goes back to the old arguments over creation and creationism as opposed to evolution. But boy, did it kick us in the shin in the early days of COVID, when at first we were all aligned, and then well-paid political operatives got some of us to say, oh, I don't believe the science, I'm not wearing masks. And climate change, right? Can't get people aligned on climate change. Social scientists, sciences like psychology, but I'm going to spend a little time on public education. Christian nationalists have been out to destroy public education since the 1950s. And they won't say that out loud often. They'll say it in other ways, but you'll see it. So next slide, please, and next slide. You've probably heard of Project 2025. You live in Northern Virginia, you've heard of Project 2025. Project 2025 calls for the end of the Department of Education, but even more, you have to read Project 20, at least scan it, to get a sense for the tone of it. The tone of it is conservatives are at war with godless liberals who are out to destroy society. I'm not overstating it. The Department of Justice, they say, is a convenient one-stop shop for the woke education cartel. How much you get paid to write that phrase, which, as the COVID era showed, is not particularly concerned with children's education. For the sake of American children, Congress should shutter it and return control of education to the states. Doug Mastriano, a Christian nationalist who ran for governor in Pennsylvania in 2022, called for halving the state's education budget and said he believed it was a mistake that Pennsylvania had started public education in the 19th century. D. James Kennedy, who if you've ever watched Christian TV, you'd have a chance of seeing him, he's from Florida, has said the modern public education system was begun in an effort to deliver children from the Christian religion. David Barton, who raises tens of millions of dollars, if not more, to promote the notion that the nation was founded as a Christian nation. All the founders, even Thomas Jefferson, were really pious Christians. His book on Jefferson was pulled from the shelves by its publisher when evangelical scholars pointed out how awful the scholarship was. Has said schools have become the enemy of the country. And so, next slide, what these paid people do is they stir up one issue after another to continue creating chaos in public schools. Are the schools woke? Are they teaching critical race theory? Are they doing DEI? What about trans kids on the track team? What about the bathrooms? Are the teachers and the librarians stocking porn in the building? And by porn, I literally mean books that might depict a child who has same-sex parents. I was with a superintendent of education a couple of weeks ago, and she was explaining her woes to someone, and I just whispered, "I saw porn in your car when you drove up." She knew what I was saying, because they have teachers get emails calling them groomers, like they're trying to turn the kids gay or trans. All the stuff over masking. All of that is meant to make, and this is where I live in central Pennsylvania, chaos in school board meetings. Then you'll hear the language of parental rights. Well, parents should have control over the curriculum their children receive. I was raised by a career high school English teacher. 150 students, let's say 30 of the parents say, well, this is what I want my kid to learn. How are you going to teach? How are you going to teach anybody with that kind of thing going on? Parental choice or public education funds going to vouchers for private schools, which has been demonstrated as clearly as anything could be demonstrated in the research, lowers educational outcomes dramatically. It's also been demonstrated that money tends to go to wealthier Americans who already had their kids enrolled in private school. So it is regressive kind of tax, actually, effectively. And of course, all the stuff about putting 10 commandments or opening prayer in school, a move that's happened in Texas and Florida, tried to happen in Pennsylvania, sought to replace school counselors who have training, right, in childhood development, social work, counseling, sort of a well-rounded school counselor education curriculum, replace them with chaplains. And let me be clear, that doesn't mean certified chaplains who are qualified in some other way, but as much as I am happy if I know someone who has a medical emergency and they see a chaplain, because those people are wonderful, they are not qualified to fill the role of school counselor. But it's another attempt to turn public schools into Christian academies. I want to move toward, and I'm a little behind my time mark, which is rare, democracy. One of the founders of the Christian homeschool movement and critic of public education was a guy named Rusas John Rushdoony. And in an interview with Bill Moyers, Rushdoony got started in the 50s, but he said, if democracy exalts man to the place of God and the will of man to the place of God, it will fail. It's failing today. Moyers pressed him. Next slide. So you think democracy substituted what for the kingdom of God? The will of the majority. Paul Weyrich, the political operative who organized the religious right, said, look, you all think we want everybody to vote. We don't want everybody to vote. For us, we do better when fewer people vote. Thus, all the effort to make it harder for people who are not white, who are younger, who are city dwellers, all those efforts to make groups that are likely not to vote Republican, to make it harder for them to vote. The Project 2025 project. Let's go 3 slides. The Project 2025 thing was sponsored by the Heritage Foundation, which used to be a respectable conservative think tank, and is now just deeply radicalized. But also, they did it in concert with other organizations, several of which are Christian nationalist organizations. And one of the drivers of it is a guy named Russ Vought, next slide, who was director of the Office of Management and Budget in the Trump administration, who has just publicly argued, I want to see Christian nationalism work. And so with all of these attitudes, next slide, this slide shows, if you move from left to right, how strongly people identify with a Christian nationalist outlook. And the prompt they're responding to is, do you think voting is a privilege rather than a right? What you see is from 10% yes to 50%, so that those who are most strongly aligned with the Christian nationalist outlook are more likely than not to think either you should earn the right to vote or you could forfeit your right to vote because it's a privilege. And the line just is almost linear, isn't it? Or the slope, my math teacher would have said, is almost linear. Christian nationalist outlook traffics in violent language. That language and violence, that language of spiritual warfare bleeds very easily. If you're fighting demons, you got to fight, right? And at one rally, Michael Flynn, who was our national security advisor, said, Nancy Pelosi not has a demon. He said, she is a demon. So what do? Well, somebody tried to kill her and almost killed her husband. The president of the Heritage Foundation said recently, we're in the process of the Second American Revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be. If that's not a threat. And Jones has found, by combining two questions, two survey prompts, do you agree that God intended America to be a promised land for European Christians? So you hear the Christian nationalism, right? God, promised land, Christians. Did you catch the racism? European Christians, we mean, right? With another question, do you agree that true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country? He's been tracking this question every year from 2021, and he found that people who agree with the Christian nationalist sentiment that is also racist, next slide, are 4 times as likely than the rest of us who disagree with it to think that true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save the country. The new number just came out is not 43%, it's 39%, I believe. Let's skip let's go 3 slides. Poor Jared. I just want to name quickly that what we're experiencing in the United States is part of an international movement of authoritarian figures who are using religion to degrade democracy where they live. The one most relevant to us is Viktor Orban in Hungary, who visited Donald Trump this summer, did not visit the White House. In 2023, CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee Conference, held their meeting outside the United States for the first time in Budapest. And Orban then was the keynote speaker in Dallas for the same gathering. He funnels Russian money to American right-wing intellectuals and has founded an institute that houses them in Budapest. I had the opportunity to study with Hungarian democracy activists for about a week last summer. But Orban claims to be founding a Christian nation. Vladimir Putin does. And there was, you've seen Tucker Carlson promoting Vladimir Putin lately in a Russian grocery store saying, see how much better it is here than in the U.S.? Hungary and Russia have like 11% church attendance, but they're Christian nations. And who wants to model our country on 2 poor, authoritarian nations? They're miserable to live in for most people. But it's not just them, right? Bolsonaro in Brazil. Or what about Islamic nationalism? Erdogan in Turkey. What about Jewish nationalism? Netanyahu in Israel. What about Hindu nationalism? Modi in India. And rarely do these figures contradict one another. More often than not, they support one another. In the presidential debate, most recently, Donald Trump praised one foreign leader, Orban. The European Parliament says Hungary is no longer a functioning democracy. How do we respond as Christians to this movement? Next slide, please. One thing that I would want to say is, and I'm in a project where I'm listening to Christian nationalist preaching. Christian nationalist preachers talk about Jesus a lot, but as a brand. Rarely do you hear them talk about things that we think about what Jesus did and said. Love your enemy. Love your neighbor as yourself. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are the lowly. Rich man and Lazarus. Good Samaritan. Rarely do they talk about those things. They talk about aligning under the banner of Jesus. Next slide. When they talk about freedom, and they talk about freedom all the time, it's freedom for them as Christians to exercise their will on the rest of society. You're a landlord, you don't want a mixed-race couple in an apartment, Christian freedom. You don't have to rent to them. You want to carry an AR-15 into a big box store. Your freedom to carry it is more important than someone else's freedom to feel secure. You're following what I'm saying. You don't like trans kids in school? Your child's freedom not to know trans people exist is more important than the freedom of trans people to exist. Next slide, please. They talk about dominion when Jesus was explicit. Don't be like the Gentiles and try to dominate other people. Use your freedom to love. Next slide, please. They just forget or won't admit that everybody is vulnerable to sin. They'll tell you if Christians are in charge, we'll have a holy country. Wow. How often are we seeing sex abuse scandals coming out of big churches now? And more recently, New Apostolic Reformation churches, one after the other, according to Matt Taylor's research. And there are Christian nationalist thinkers calling for a new Caesar to overthrow democracy and make the United States right. Well, what did Jesus have to say about Caesar? So, final slide, next one. What do I recommend for you? Second time I did this presentation, someone said, "That's scary and you gave us nothing." Dead accurate criticism. And it sent me to really think and listen first. Guard your soul, whatever that means to you. Because a lot of you right now, and visiting here, just like I am, a lot of you say, "I'm anxious, I'm afraid." Not many of you have said to me, "I'm angry," or "I'm tense." I am. I'm losing sleep. Some of you have told me your families and friendships are fractured. Me too. Me too. And so in a time when there's so much at stake and you're feeling this pressure, if it's traditional spiritual practices like worship and prayer and meditation and scripture study, guard your soul. If it's petting the dog, I'm not going to say cat, if it's petting the dog or loving your grandchild or your partner or whomever, if it feeds your soul, if it's the arts, if it's music, and it keeps your heart merciful and kind and humble and flexible, do all of that because you're being called upon to be active in a world that will test your spiritual pliability. Guard your soul. Because I'm also asking you to be vigilant. And I said several times this weekend, I don't watch the news, anybody's news, because the news is trying to mess us up and get us angry and upset and scared. I read the news like a hawk. And what I do that most people don't do, but it's true, read the local news. Now here, right, you got, what does local news mean in the metro area? But because so much Christian nationalist activity is happening in county commissioners' races and school boards that most of us just breeze by. State legislatures, you got that in Virginia. So you have to be watching what's going on. And even in the number of weeks left before the election, and let me tell you, you may be called upon after the election, organize. It is not enough just to vote. If you're writing postcards, which I just learned about here, if you knock on doors, if you have money to give, if you're making phone calls, if you're part of a civic organization that works for democracy, I would encourage you to register as a poll worker or volunteer to be an poll watcher or election worker. Because people who want to undermine democracy are highly activated. They work overtime, but somehow we imagine, I'm going to vote. I'm going to do my duty and vote. And the activity of a minority that's highly energized will overwhelm a majority that's taking things for granted or waiting and hoping. No matter what, when it's possible, treat everyone as a human being. And there may be times, I know it's happened, I just had a friend, I was driving down and called a hometown friend, who talked about the abuse his daughters were receiving from one of their uncles. There may be times to just stand up and tell somebody to back the heck up, right? And get between someone and harm or abuse, or to tell somebody to back up to you because they're being abusive. But ordinarily, don't, and I mean online too, don't make fun, don't insult, don't belittle, because all you do is harden that attitude and recruit volunteers for the anti-democratic movement. I'm a professor. To get a PhD, you have to study languages. But somehow I never had to study. All of us academics, our second language is snarkiness. It is deadly. It's deadly, right? You hear me using it now, but it's really not the way to engage other people. So what do I encourage you to do? And I really mean this. After this, go get a tablet of paper, pencil or pen, not electronics, and write down, what do I truly, deeply value? What do I truly, deeply want for the society? What am I afraid of? Because I'm going to invite you to do something. I'm former Southern Baptist. Evangelicals do it. Black churches do it. Testify. Learn to testify. Learn to tell your story. And that might mean something like this. I want every child to have access to the same quality of education my grandson has. I don't want anyone to lose medical coverage for their pre-existing condition. Almost everybody my age has pre-existing conditions. I do. That would devastate me. I want to live in a society where everybody is here, however they got here, are treated as full human beings, and if you want to say in a Christian way, as created in the image of God. Every human, regardless of why they're here, how they got here, what they've done, anything. I want those kinds of things. I want a society in which everyone has access to voting. I don't want to live in a society where one narrow group gets to pray on behalf of me and my family, and we have to sit under that. I don't want to live in a society that's governed by one narrow set of religious principles. I don't want to live in a society where we're taught to be suspicious of our neighbors. Now, there are some people who could argue with that door, but it is hard to argue with somebody's heart. And in the long run, if you want to influence someone, none of you has more than 5 times in your life had a conversation where you were disagreeing with someone about some hot issue, and you said something so brilliant They said, I've been wrong my whole life. If you've done that 5 times, you're a superhero. We change our minds, all of us change our mind in relationship and over time. Now, we're in an emergency right now, and that requires activating and winning. There's no dodging it. But we're also in a struggle that's going to last a generation. And if you want to have any chance of moving people who are in the process of becoming radicalized, and that is what it is, radicalized, then learn to be kind and testify. So thank you for listening to me so long. I understand there's going to be a moving microphone. And Pastor Laura has it, so she's fierce. She'll turn it off on you. But do you have things you'd like to talk about?
I have a question. What is the gender split? It's turned on. Jared, does that help?
And Jared, hello. Jared, thank you.
Thank you, Jared.
Thank you.
Just curious about the gender split of the white Christian nationalist population.
I don't know. For sure, patriarchy is a value of white Christian nationalists. I have no reason to think that Christian nationalists are more male than female. And the reason I say that is activity in religion is more female than male, generally. So while clearly there's a huge gender split in surveys about voting, I don't know if that applies to that movement or not.
But in leadership, it's dominant.
In leadership, it is there are different streams, and some of the streams want leaders who are male. But Donald Trump's spiritual advisor is Paul White, who's a prophet and an apostle. So it does vary. I wouldn't just overgeneralize on it. And I'll say some of the most influential prophets and apostles are women.
I wonder what you think about the white Southerners that left schools after segregation. I'm from the South like you are, and we saw almost all the white schools in any urban area just totally turn black very quickly, and the whites go to segregation academies, religious academies, which seems to me is kind of an indoctrination, and I wonder if that played a role in the rise of Christian nationalism.
Brown versus Board of Education played a role. The effort to do public school vouchers goes back to a reaction to Brown, just like you're talking about. I've lived in Memphis for 6 years, where almost all the private Christian schools, 1971, 1973, and I could go on about that, but there's a definite connection. There are the people who study international democracy and how democracies fail will tell you there are 2 conditions that make a democracy unsteady. One is high levels of economic inequality. The other is rapid social change. And Robert Jones, who I mentioned earlier, his first book was The End of White Christian America. 20 years ago, about 60% of Americans identified as white and Christian. In the data they just released, that number is 41%. And a lot of the activity we have is a response, and when that language of take America back, you won't have a country anymore, all of that is targeted at this demographic fear. So that's not your exact question, but you see the power of your question opening up this big picture of what's going on. So you could have a movement sort of boiling, but people are angry that they're left out economically. They're looking for someone to blame, and the demographic change. And let's be frank, if you are a social conservative, the change in people just coming out in the LGBTQ community and receiving human rights, to you, they feel like it's rapid. I'm not defending it. I can't tell you how many dozens of presentations I've done in churches for inclusion. I'm just saying that's how people feel is threatened. There was a comment or question up here.
I recently saw a piece, the headline was, I think I have this right, what Christian liberals get wrong about Jesus' teaching, and the writer said, oh, Jesus didn't, he said, feed the poor. He didn't say, have the government feed the poor. He said, heal the sick. He didn't say, have the government. So they have it wrong, he said. Is that tied in, is that philosophy that the
That
government
is
has
very
no role?
much.
Is that,
So imagine it this way, if you will. Yes, the argument that things like care for the poor and health care should be, and education, should be the responsibility of the church. If I personally think that that's a cynical way of saying, I want government to die. Right? So, of course, Jesus didn't say the government should feed the poor. How was that going to happen in his world? And what did healthcare look like in his world? Public education, right? Of course. And so it seems like that argument doesn't seem like a good faith argument to me. But it sure powerfully persuades some people to stand in what are already their political prejudices. I recommend, if anyone's interested, a book. I think the author's name is Jonathan Meitzel. He's a public health professor at Vanderbilt, Dying of Whiteness, where he argues that so many white Americans favor policies that can be proven to be deadly to white people because they think the beneficiaries of those policies are not white. And of course, it's politicians and a little bit of common knowledge that convince them of that. That book is worth reading just because you're interested in being a citizen, but I think that's in the mix of your question too.
I have some pretty serious concerns about the confluence between Christian nationalism and our judiciary system, in particular the influence of those beliefs in the Supreme Court and the idea of constitutional originalism as well as biblical literalism, and those two kind of also becoming conflated. I know this is a really big topic, but could you speak briefly to your feelings about what Christian nationalism is doing to, in particular, the Supreme Court?
You are a nerd. Absolutely right. I'm a nerd too. Well, look at this church. But Leonard Leo, who founded the Federalist Society, raised over $1 billion last year. And he, and we think one of our Supreme Court justices, and J.D. Vance are heavily influenced by Catholic integralism. One of the weirdest things that happened was in the pictures of the January 6th insurrection, you saw the Appeal to Heaven flag, which is a white flag with a pine tree, an apostle named Dutch Sheets. Look him up on YouTube. He has a daily show. Look how many people watch it. An apostle named Dutch Sheets turned to that flag, which is a Revolutionary War flag, right? It comes from the language of Thomas Paine. When your grievances aren't being addressed, you appeal to heaven, which means you go to war and let God sort it out. And he started promoting that flag. And then reporters picked up that flag sits right outside Speaker of the House Mike Johnson's office. And then reporters found out that Samuel Alito had been flying that. How does a Roman Catholic get a New Apostolic Reformation symbol? Oh, we're into history. Right? It isn't just the judiciary. And in the Atlantic, Ann Applebaum, who I respect a lot, wrote a piece about failing trust in our judicial system, which kind of breaks my heart, as a sign of democracy. I'm very concerned that at least 3 Supreme Justices might be parts of that movement. At least 3.
What is the movement you're talking about?
Catholic integralism.
Catholic what?
Integralism, which is essentially the argument that government should promote the ends of the church.
Greg, you talked about organizing. I don't know if you're comfortable doing this, but would you suggest any organizations, or if I were to say, like, for example, we work with Poor People's Campaign, Working America. Are there others that come to mind? People, I think, are really thinking of where do I put my energy, my time, my togetherness, our resources to be most effective?
I know Poor People's Campaign reasonably well and just endorse it highly. Organizing could mean partisan activities too. I can't speak as well to this local context because a lot of the best organizing is local or regional. In Pennsylvania, we have Power Interfaith, it started in Philly and it's spreading, and we're highly organized, and I just went to a training Thursday to prevent election subversion. So I can't do that well for you. You just did it way better than I could, Laura.
Other questions?
When
We
I
knew
look at my
Bob would
watch,
have a
it's
question for
to
us.
monitor me, not you.
Actually, it may be more of a question to the staff here. Will this presentation be available online? I'd like to forward a link to some friends.
Yes, it's being live streamed now, and then will be available afterwards as well.
Just a question about what you were saying in Pennsylvania about being trained as election workers or post-election workers. Does anyone know of something around here?
Yes. There's Virginia election protection work, and Ike Jones has been part of that here at Rock Spring. I know Arlene, I'll let you say, if you want to say anything else about that, but you could be trained to actually be there at the polls. Virginia election protection. Yes, and you can write to Arlene or write to me.
The email that I guess Laura sent out on Wednesday has from Rock Spring. Okay, so if you don't look at your emails every day, it's got a whole list of different opportunities, from writing letters with Amy Bergner's going to be doing more with Working America, the voter protection election, Ike Jones, either he had the training or is going to it. They do need people, and it's all throughout Virginia. What else? We're waiting to see with the Poor People's Campaign, maybe doing some even canvassing in Pennsylvania, and then also waiting to get instructions for texting, both from Poor People's Campaign and the Center for Common Ground, and that you could do sitting at home, and we'll keep you posted if there's anything else that we learn.
And we also have a Faith and Democracy mailing list at the church, and if you want to be added to that, you can contact Ashley in the office. But at this point, we're putting most of our opportunities out to the whole congregation. So just look at the regular emails from the church as well.
I'd like to give you just a little bit of hope. I think there's good reason for hope, actually. I don't think of hope as the same as optimism. You have to have a reason to have hope. You can just be an optimist, but for hope, you have to have something. I think there's good reason for hope. I'm talking about elections that can be close, right? There are parts of the country where people are working really hard for human dignity and democracy, and no time soon are they going to be winning big elections, right? But when it's competitive, the reason I do these presentations is when people know what they're actually up against, they reject Christian nationalism. We've seen it in Lancaster County in districts that are predictably red in most elections, but in school board elections, when people would name and write letters to the editor, which I know that's not relevant for most people in Washington, to place a letter to the editor. But when they do that, we had some losses, but in some very red districts, we had wins in school board elections. And yes, that mapped in a partisan way, but what it was about was, are you for kids or are you for this Christian right agenda? When people know, when Doug Mastriano ran for governor of Pennsylvania, in a year that a Republican should have won, he lost by 15 points. And what will happen is that people who run with a Christian nationalist agenda will give it away. They'll talk about it some places, and other places, like in the school board elections, I'm for students, I'm for parents, I just want Yeah, but we know what you've been doing the past year in school board meetings. So have hope that part of the work is just naming what you value and calling attention to what's actually happening. And that doesn't require arguing. I had the sense that was all the comments or questions. If there are more, we have time.
You've done a great job of talking about the threat of Christian nationalism to democracy. We all know the stats of mainline Christianity and how the church overall is in decline. How do you think, can you talk about how Christian nationalism is impacting that trend?
Yes. So there are a lot of reasons that among white people, a lot of reasons Christianity is in decline. Some are just basic social, all kinds of community activities, organizations are in decline. Rotary clubs, softball leagues, you name it. That's been true for like 50 years, and the church is experiencing that. So there's that. Younger kids grow up in a world where Christianity isn't the only obvious choice, and they think, oh, well, they believe that, but yeah, that's my kids, to be honest. But one of the driving factors of people leaving the church is, well, I'll name two, the perception that Christians are mean, hypocritical, and that's tied to the right-wing politicization of the church. It's measurable. And I shared with you, so it was a good setup. I saw the setup. I was just doing a group of retired businessmen in Lancaster, about a dozen of them. 4 said, over the past few years, and they implied very clearly for political reasons, I'm done with my congregation and I'm done with my party. The one thing I didn't mention is that in the new PRI data, because what we had been hearing is that white evangelicals are growing, mainline whites and Catholic whites are declining. Mainliners have somehow stabilized. And among that 41% of Americans who are white Christians is almost evenly divided among evangelicals, mainline Protestants, and Roman Catholics. And I mean almost even. So a lot of the trends are showing that people are fleeing the evangelical world. Sex scandals are in there too. Sex scandals would be better put as clergy abuse scandals are in there too. So that is a great question. But no question, the politics, and check myself, I would even say that in white mainline churches, we don't want to over-politicize it. So I love what y'all are doing. You're talking about it's voting season and it's democracy. That's attractive. But we can't be the opposite of the Christian right and say, we're rallying for this party, we're rallying for this candidate, here's your voting guide, this is what you should think, all the way to if you vote Democrat, you're not a good Christian. We can't be the opposite of that. But encouraging people to be empowered and take action, addressing issues in our communities, giving people an opportunity to participate in making things better for people who are hurting, good, 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 good. Yeah.
What portion of Catholics are?
I'll repeat. What portion of Catholics are Catholic integralists? I think that's really on the edges of Roman Catholicism, but it has an appeal in a certain intellectual stream. And I don't have the link with me, but J.D. Vance in 2019 or 2020 published an essay in The Torch. You can Google it and read it, where he talks about his conversion to Catholicism and how it shaped his social attitudes. Now, we've seen lately when he's talking about Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, that he will also just lie. But when you read that piece, I think you will read it as what a true religious convert would say to describe what happened to them. And then you and I might say, well, he was radicalized. I would say that. But, J.D. Vance is a very intelligent person and apparently sensitive, reflective, and moved into this stream. So I'm not trying to dodge your question. I don't know the answer, but I would just say it seems to be some very activated people. The other thing you could do is you could look up a very recent article in Rolling Stone about J.D. Vance and a group called the Theobros. And that reporter was just in Lancaster County preparing a series on Christian nationalism. So I'm eager to see what comes out of that. But it is thick, good reporting. And she's broken some other important stories. Yeah. Okay. Let me just say thank you. You're going to say thank you. But y'all have tolerated this. Thank you so much.